Everyone.
Okay, I think we are on. Time now 2 minutes past 8 a.m. On the Friday, April 18th, 2024 in Japan Standard Time. Let me. Welcome to another edition of the World Bank Tokyo Online Morning Seminar. My name is Koichi Omori. I am a Senior External Affairs Officer of the World Bank based in Tokyo. Every year, twice a year actually, in the April and also October, each of the regional chief economic offices of the World Bank would put together and publish the regional economic update of respective regions. And then last week, we started featuring those regional economic updates, starting with the East Asia and the Pacific. This week, we are featuring South Asia Development Update, April 2024 edition, titled the Jobs for Resilience, which is this one. So today we have the economists from the Office of the Chief Economist for the South Asia region. Let me very briefly introduce each one of them. We have Chief Economist Francisca Odedoge, who is joining us, and also we have Patrick Kirby, the Senior Economist. We have Zoe Liu-Xie, the Senior Economist, and also Jonah Lexia, who is the economist. All of them are from the Office of the Chief Economist for South Asia region. And the next 30-40 minutes or so, we are going to listen to them, summarizing the main findings and main points of the latest edition of the South Asia Development Update. Then after that, I will read the question that we received from you on behalf of you. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please send your question by using the online form posted on the announcement page of the seminar, or you can simply post your question on the chat section of the YouTube screen, or you can even send a question to me directly by email so that I read your question on your behalf. So with that, perhaps I would like to pass the microphone to Francisca to open and kick off the presentation. Francisca, please come in. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Koichi. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning to you. Good evening, DC. It's a pleasure to be here to talk to you, to discuss with you the outlook for South Asia. South Asia may be looking very good compared to other regions at the moment, in terms of growth at least. But it faces unique challenges from climate change. And the solutions are non-trivial because some of the solutions for adapting to climate change require progress in development, especially in creating jobs. So this is what my colleagues will present to you, the analysis my colleagues will present to you today. And it is critical for this region in particular is critical for global development because it is home to about a quarter of the world's extreme poor. So this combination of development and climate changes is particularly challenging and matters for global development as well. And with that, I hand over to my colleagues. Patrick, are you starting?
Absolutely. So thank you for that nice introduction. We're going to touch on three major questions here. I'm going to start by talking about the growth outlook for South Asia, and then Jonah is going to talk about how households, firms, and farms adapt to climate risks, and Zoe is going to talk about what is holding back job creation in South Asia. And throughout it all, we'll talk about the policy implications of the various points that we make. So I'll jump right into the first question. So before I get into South Asia, I want to give a bit of global context. The last few years with the pandemic and the rebound from the pandemic have been extremely tumultuous. And you can see that on this left chart here, which the blue line shows actual growth, collapsing, global recession in 2020, rebounding. And the next few years, we expect global growth to basically converge to something like its estimated potential. So things are becoming less chaotic. In our forecast. That's shocks can always happen, of course, but that's our base forecast. The other big point I want to make here with the right figure is that things have turned out not too badly for a lot of major economies. So the blue bars on the chart show the growth forecast for major economies at the end of 2022. And then the red bars show the latest forecast for major economies. You can see in all occasions, things have turned out better. In the US, growth was expected to be very low. It's been far above expectation. The euro area was expected to fall into recession. It avoided that, if not by much. In China is of course struggling with issues in its property sector, but these have not had as many negative spillovers as expected. And India has surpassed expectations as well. So a challenging few years, but many countries have come out on the other side not looking too badly. There are many exceptions, though, that have done quite poorly, and you'll see what I'm talking about in a few moments. Before that, I want to talk about a few other global developments. Coming out of the pandemic, there was a massive increase in inflation, globally synchronized. You can see this here. All around the world, inflation shot up as supply chains were choked, the composition of demand changed. And a lot of that inflation has now reversed. We're still not back towards pre-pandemic levels, of course, and a lot of advanced economies, a lot of central bankers continue to talk about how the last mile is the hardest. So there's a way to go, but there has been a lot of progress on fighting inflation. And the blue line there shows South Asia, where inflation has come down, as with other areas, but not quite as much, largely because of persistently high food inflation. In response to high inflation, we've had a massively coordinated and rapid global monetary tightening cycle. So this is just the count of central banks in the world, whether they're tightening policy or loosening policy. And you can see around the middle of 2022, essentially every central bank was tightening, almost every central bank. And now that pace of tightening has slowed down, and some emerging markets, including some in South Asia, have even started easing policy a little bit. So that's another major global development. This right chart that I just put up strikes a cautionary note, however. It shows all of the loosening cycles by the Federal Reserve in previous monetary policy loosening cycles. So the US Federal Reserve, most important central bank, to a large degree sets global monetary policy. And you can see in an average loosening cycle, it cuts rates by something like 500, 600 basis points. This upcoming loosening cycle, it's expected that it'll be much less than that. So much less policy loosening than is normally seen. So companies, governments that are struggling with high interest rates, they might see some relief, but maybe not as much as they would like. Onto the growth prospects for South Asia. So you can see here that South Asia is expected to grow around 6%, which is close to its pre-pandemic average over the next few years. However, there's some major caveats to that narrative. If you take out India, then you can see that South Asia is actually not really doing any better than other emerging markets, and it's doing considerably worse than its pre-pandemic average. And the reason for that I alluded to earlier, there's a group of countries that have not done well in this recent period of high interest rates, and that is financially stressed emerging markets. These are countries that are rated C or worse by Moody's, or that are assessed by the IMF, World Bank, to be in or near debt distress. And you can see these countries growing at about 2%, not even, despite the fact that many of them are quite poor. And South Asia has many of these countries in them. And these countries, you can see they're recovering from severe currency crises in the aftermath of the pandemic, but it's not a rapid recovery. They're still far below their pre-pandemic average growth rate. The other caveat to the above average South Asian growth story is that a lot of this growth is coming from public sector support. So the public sector is spending a lot of money and boosting growth, and that may not be sustainable. I'll skip the country-specific narratives. The basic point is the same. India is really driving growth. Let me pick up on that public sector. So a lot of growth in South Asia is dependent on the public sector. It's more, the region is more dependent on public spending than elsewhere. And that's a problem because government debt in the region has increased more rapidly than in other emerging markets, CMDs we call them, and is at a far higher level than others. And you can see that on the left chart. And the root cause of that is that government revenues in the region are extremely low. The averaging emerging market development economy collects just under 30% of GDP in revenues. And you can see some countries in the region collect not even 10 percentage points of GDP. So they still have the same government functions they need to provide, but they don't collect the revenues. And so that is why they've had to lean so heavily on debt. And that unfortunately has led to some problems in some countries such as Sri Lanka, which defaulted not too long ago in terms of servicing that debt. The other concern is that the public sector is doing a lot of the heavy lifting and private investment is not. And you can see here, private investment growth at about 4% in the latest data is better than other emerging markets, but it's not near close enough to, it's not at the same level as pre-pandemic, and it's not fast enough to really propel growth. So the growth rate is okay, but the level is quite low. And you can see that in the middle chart here that shows that private investment as a share of GDP is considerably lower than in other emerging markets, 7 percentage points of GDP less spent on private investment than in other emerging markets. We did an experiment. We looked at all the cases since the 60s of a rapid private investment growth. And then we studied what were the conditions that made these booms more likely, these big private investment accelerations. And there were two things that we found that were particularly important for South Asia. Around the time where these booms start, there tend to be increases in a country's openness. So trade openness, capital account openness, either one of these tends to make these private acceleration booms more likely. And you can see that's a big deal for South Asia because trade and capital openness in the region is considerably lower than in other emerging market and developing economies. The other one is governance. If governance was to increase to the level of the top quartile of emerging market and developing economies, you would see a meaningfully higher probability of these booms starting if these relationships were causal. So we've talked about some of the challenges. Now I'll quickly go over some of the risks. I might skip over this one very quickly in the interest of time, but the region has had severe problems with currency crises in the aftermath of the pandemic, and we see that the risks of these being re-triggered by global developments is reasonably high. So you can see here, South Asia had far more currency depreciation than other regions. And despite some improvement in fiscal and current account balances, there's still some danger. primarily coming from the financial sector, which has relatively low levels of health, according to some of the metrics we look at here. Reserves are also very low. I'll skip over that. To improve the pace of growth, primarily through private investment, and lower the risks, one of the things the region could do is open up its financial sector. Here we have an index that shows an index of controls on the financial sectors and how it sets interest rates. And you can see South Asia is higher than other emerging market and developing regions. So the average emerging market is in blue. The range of all of them, excluding South Asia, is in gray. And you can see South Asia, despite being considerably more liberal than in the 80s, is still fairly tight and perhaps even trending in the wrong direction. So loosening up the controls on the financial sector might help boost private investment particularly. And the other thing the region could do is boost those tax revenues. And one of the ways that they could do it in a way that would be positive both for revenues and for trade openness would be to shift some of its revenue gathering away from the border where it's concentrated. You can see a higher share of revenues are captured at the border relative to other emerging markets, and shift it towards the domestic economy. The other outlook risk that's very important is climate change. Climate is hitting this region extremely hard. You can see the middle chart here shows that a lot of land area in major economies in the region is already affected by extreme drought in at least 1 month every year. You can see 60% of land in Pakistan, 30% in Bangladesh and India, and that share has been increasing rapidly over recent decades. And land isn't the only thing affected by climate change. You can see that people, it's becoming too hot to work outside for about an extra hour a day. It's already very hot in many of these regions, too hot to work for almost 8 hours a day. And if under the conservative 2-degree emissions scenario, another hour a day would be too hot to work in. So both the land would be parched and the people would be cooked in the heat. And Jonah will pick up some of the messages on that.
Thank you, Patrick. So as my colleague Patrick has explained, South Asia is one of the most exposed regions in the world to climate change. Could we go to the, yes, thank you. So the left-hand chart here gives us the standard Notre Dame University Climate Vulnerability Index by region, right? And what we see here is that South Asia is, according to this metric, the most exposed region in the world to climate change. So South Asia is affected by many types of climate change: sea level rise, natural disasters, extreme heat, and according to this index, it's the world's most exposed region among all emerging market and developing economies. And on the right-hand side here, we have a chart that shows us the number of people that are affected by natural disasters annually. About 60 million South Asians are affected by natural disasters annually on average over the past 10 years. That's also the highest of any emerging market and developing economy region in the world. And so climate change will generate serious economic damages in this region: reductions in agricultural yield, labor productivity, destruction of physical and human capital, just to name a few, right? And so it's going to be kind of a first order challenge for maintaining economic growth and momentum in the region, and adaptation to climate change is going to be absolutely essential. Next slide. All right. And so who does climate change affect most? To answer this question, we reviewed 70 studies on the economic impacts of climate events, the whole literature that we could find on the subject. And here are a couple of charts to kind of illustrate the incidence of climate change. First, what we found was on the left-hand side, most of these studies focused on flooding and other natural disasters, with a handful of studies on drought and extreme heat. And on the right-hand side, what we find is that the poor are more exposed to climate shocks on average. So about 60% of studies found that poor people were more exposed to climate shocks than the average person. By exposure, we mean that they live in areas that are more affected by these climate change events. But not only are they more exposed, they're also more affected given this exposure. So about 80% of the studies found that the poor were more likely to be affected by climate shocks. And you can think of this as income losses, human capital losses, mortality losses. We looked across a wide range of outcomes, right? And so about 80% of the literature finds that the poor lose more when climate change hits. And so what that suggests is that the poor are going to bear the burden of private adaptation to climate change. And so the question that we ask then is can it be done? Can we adapt to climate change? And historically, how effective is adaptation? To answer this question, we reviewed several thousand studies on climate change, of which we narrowed it down to about 300 that were on climate change adaptation. And we wanted to get a sense of what the impact of climate change adaptation is. But in the studies that we looked at, there's a lot of heterogeneity. There are different outcomes that are looked at, for example, agricultural yield or human mortality, human capital, income losses. And we also looked at there's a wide variety of different climate shocks, heat, extreme heat, flood, drought. And so how do we standardize across all of these, myriad different settings in order to get one summary estimate of the impact of climate change? We define this concept called the adaptation ratio. And what that measures is the share of climate damages that are offset by a particular adaptation strategy, what we call the adaptation ratio. And it generally should range between 0 and 1. And so 0 is kind of completely ineffective adaptation that doesn't recover any of the costs of climate shocks, and 1 would be perfectly effective adaptation. What we find in the literature when we pool all of these estimates in a meta-analysis is that the average effect is that about 46% of the economic losses to climate change are reversed on average by adaptation. So about half. Not perfect, but it's still something, right? But this covers a lot of heterogeneity across different types of actors in the economy. So what this figure in front of you is going to do is it's going to split this by households, firms, and farmers. And these are agents that employ a wide variety of different adaptation strategies. Each dot on these figures is an estimate of the impact of adaptation for one of the studies that we reviewed. And so just to give you a couple of examples, households tend to adjust to climate change by migrating to perhaps less climate exposed regions, by adjusting their labor supply, by availing themselves of relief programs, cash transfers, and other public interventions. Firms tend to adjust by using technology. For example, a factory might install air conditioning when it gets too hot to work, or they might adopt other kind of improved management practices that help them deal with climate stress. Another way that firms tend to adapt is with supply chain reallocation. They adjust their composition of suppliers to those that are less exposed, for example, to flooding or extreme heat. And then lastly, farmers tend to adjust by reallocating the portfolio of crops that they grow. For example, they'll grow drought-resistant wheat, or they'll grow different crops that are less flood sensitive. And they also tend to use agricultural crop insurance. So those are kind of the different ways that agents can adapt. And as you can see from these figures, there's a wide range of effectiveness, both within and across groups in these adaptation strategies. Now, how effective are different adaptation strategies? On the left-hand side, what we find is that it doesn't really matter what kind of climate shock you're looking at. Generally, adaptation is kind of broadly similarly effective across different types of climate risks, from flooding to droughts to natural disasters and heat increases. But there is a big difference in terms of the effectiveness of adaptation across different types of agents in the economy. So those firms, which I mentioned, rely mostly on technology. They are much more likely to recoup the costs of climate change. About 70% of the economic losses from these climate events are recouped or offset by firms' adaptation strategies. For households, this number is just under 50%. And for farmers, agricultural producers, it's about a third, right? So So firms are kind of the best at adapting to climate change. Households and farmers have a more difficult time. And what can kind of explain the differences in these abilities to adapt? Well, these agents are using different adaptation strategies. And in particular, how can we, from a policy perspective, how can we boost the adaptation effectiveness of households and farmers? Well, the key is to look at the effectiveness of different adaptation strategies. So what we find here is that the public sector is important. Roads and bridges that provide connectivity during floods, piped waters, irrigation canals that help, crop productivity during droughts, health clinics that reduce infant mortality during heat waves, right? Even social protection and transfers that help post-disaster relief. These are more effective on average than purely private adjustments. And one of the key messages that we have in the chapter is that good development is also good adaptation. The more that you provide these basic public goods, the more resilient societies will be in the face of climate change. But there are substantial differences in the effectiveness of different private adaptation strategies. Right? What we see on the right-hand side is technology is quite effective. It mitigates about 60% of climate losses, and that's one of the reasons why firms do so well in adapting to climate change, because they're much more likely and able to adopt technologies. However, when households can't rely on public support like social protection transfers, they tend to use labor markets to adjust to climate change. So think about migrating to different areas which are less exposed to climate shocks, or changing sectors, for example, from agriculture to non-agriculture to less climate-sensitive sectors. These strategies are very common in the literature among households because they're broadly relatively easy to adopt. The costs of migration or changing sectors are reasonably low relative to, for example, technology adoption, but unfortunately, they're not very effective. Right? They recover only about 15% of the losses from climate shocks. And so this is really what constrains households and farmers in increasing their effectiveness of adaptation, is that they're really relying on labor markets, right? And so what that implies, of course, is that stronger labor markets would dramatically improve household adaptation capacity. And I'll let my colleague Zoe talk a little bit more about labor markets in the region.
Thank you, Jonah. Yes, so our third question is, why is job creation so weak? And so for this chapter, or this part of the talk, we'll talk about, in general, give you an overview of job creation in the region, benchmarking it to the rest of the emerging market and developing economies, and then we'll move on to see what are some of the obstacles and what are the policy implications for the labor market. Yeah, so to start, here is a chart that provides an overview of job creation. So for this analysis, we look at a measure called employment ratio. So that's the percent of employment as a percent of working age population. And the reason we use this measure is because South Asia still has a growing working age population, and we want to see what's the region, how much employment is the region generating, given the growing working age population, to see if the employment generation has kept pace with the growth in working age population. And the answer is no. So over the past 2 decades, since 2000, you can see in the chart, on the first chart, other EMD countries, on average, the employment ratio has kept constant roughly. But South Asia, for South Asia, the employment ratio is both lower and it's been declining from 2000 to the early 2020. There is a little bit of blip uptick in 2023, but the data is preliminary, so we are still trying to see if that pattern holds. And a lot of the weaknesses in the region's employment, unsurprisingly, is because the region's women, the employment ratio for women are much, much lower than the ratio for other EMDs. So in the center, you see that for other EMDs, the ratio is about 60%. For South Asia, the average is about 30%. So that's a substantial difference. But besides women, actually the situation is not looking so good for the region's men either. So in the right chart, the last one, you can see that for South Asia, men's employment ratio has been declining. In the early 2000s and the first part of 2010s, South Asia's men actually were employed more than in other EMDs. So when we talked about, even our office had a last employment report, I think in 2018, back then analysis pointed to the strong employment among men in South Asia, but that's no longer the case. As you can see that since the late 2010s and into the 2020s, men's employment ratio in South Asia has been either below or on par with other EMDs. So what's the reason behind this lack of job creation in South Asia? Next slide, please. Thank you. Here's a cartoon to sort of hammer in the idea. So as we find out that this is really about structural transformation, or what we call structural transformation being stuck. So you can imagine structural transformation being a two-wheel carriage. On the one side, you have agriculture sector that's becoming more productive and as a result shedding labor. On the other hand, you have non-agricultural sectors such as industry, manufacturing, services that's actively absorbing labor. But in the case of South Asia, what we find is that agriculture sector is really shedding labor, but non-agriculture is not doing so well in creating labor, which is what we call the lopsided or one-sided stuck. Next slide, please. Yes, so to give you more of a concrete idea, here we show, the first chart is still the aggregate, what you've seen before. And in the center, you can see that, as I said, for agriculture, South Asia is doing exactly what other emerging markets and developing countries are doing, which is it's shedding labor. But for non-agriculture, that's the chart on the right-hand side, South Asia's employment ratio is a lot lower than other EMDs, and it is rising not as fast as in other EMDs. So to give you a concrete idea, in the past 22 years, so since 2000, South Asia's employment ratio in non-agricultural sector rose only by 5 percentage points of working age population, whereas elsewhere in other EMDs, it's 12 percentage points. So that's a big difference. And it's actually quite widespread problem in the region. So next slide, please. Thank you. It's quite widespread across South Asian countries. So the first chart here shows you the non-agriculture sector employment ratio change over the past 22 years since 2000, between 2000 and 2022. So what you can see is that we're showing the 7 countries in South Asia besides Afghanistan, and we're comparing the change in non-agriculture employment ratio, the increase to the average increase in other EMDs. And as you can see, only Bangladesh and Bhutan had bigger increases in the sector's employment ratio, whereas all the other 5 countries had increases smaller than the EMD average. And there are 3 countries, that's India, Maldives, and Pakistan, that actually fell in the bottom quartile of other EMDs. And next, thank you. Yes, so because of the slow increase or lack of increase in non-agriculture employment ratio, if we look at in 2022, non-agriculture employment ratio in all the countries, South Asian countries, except for Maldives, actually fell in the bottom quartile of other EMDs, which you can see because they're all below the red shaded region, which shows the interquartile range of other EMD countries. Next slide. Thank you. So to really look at long-run trend, we ran a panel regression of around 103 EMD countries, and we control for several country-specific characteristics over time, including the growth of productivity, the growth of working age population, and initial conditions. And then we recover what we allow each country to converge to its own long-run steady-state employment ratio. So these charts are showing you the deviation of each South Asia country from the EMD average employment ratio. On the left-hand side, you can see that in agriculture, most of South Asia countries are actually doing very similarly to what other EMDs. So the blue bar shows the deviation, and the yellow whisker shows the confidence band. Most of the confidence band are actually very wide, which means most South Asian countries are converging to agriculture employment ratio, which are very similar to the EMD average. The outlier is Nepal, which seems to be converging to a steady state with a lot higher agriculture employment ratio. What's more important is the second chart in the middle, which shows the long-run non-agriculture employment ratio in the region. And so 3 out of 5 countries, those are India, Nepal, and Pakistan, are converging to non-agriculture employment ratios substantially below the EMD average in the range of 10 to 20 percentage points. And next one, thank you. And another point to point out is that this is also the case for women. So as I mentioned before, women's employment ratio is a lot lower in the region compared to the EMD average. So here you can see this is also true in the long run, as our analysis shows that 4 out of the 5 South Asian countries actually will have women's employment ratio converging to substantially below EMD average. Next slide, please. So then the next question is, now we know the non-agriculture or lack of job creation in non-agriculture is really driving the lack of job creation overall in the region. What are some of the policies we can consider? So we did some further analysis to recover the correlates. What are some policy or country characteristics are correlated with high aggregate long-run employment ratios or long-run employment ratios in specific sectors? And these correlates are actually quite as you would expect. For example, less onerous tax regime, less policy uncertainty, including less corruption, less political instability are all correlated with higher aggregate long-run employment ratios, whereas larger firms' establishment sizes, greater trade openness, better education, easier access to land, these factors are all correlated with non-agriculture employment ratio being higher. On the women's side, we also found legal protection and women's rights being quite correlated with long-run women's employment ratio. And quite a few of these factors actually are disadvantage for South Asia, which means South Asia perform poorly relative to other regions. Next, please. So here is a chart which shows you a few of these characteristics or factors. For example, so the chart basically shows the range of each characteristic for South Asian countries, and the yellow whisker shows the interquartile range for other EMDs. For example, in manufacturing establishment, that's the first bar in the left, that shows that a lot of South Asian countries actually have much smaller manufacturing establishment size than the interquartile range of EMD countries. And that's especially the case for services establishment size and exports. So for example, in exports, you can see that that's the second bar from the right. All of South Asian countries are actually in the bottom quartile of other EMDs. Next, thank you. Because of these shortcomings or lack of progress in these key characteristics or factors, South Asian countries are lagging. So if we take our regression analysis as causal, and we could actually impute or create these counterfactual experiments. For example, we can say that what if South Asian countries had the median size of manufacturing establishment size of the EMDE. So on the right chart shows exactly that experiment. And so what it shows is that if South Asian countries had the median of other EMD countries in each of these characteristics, then the non-agricultural employment ratio could be increased between 3 and 13 percentage points, which is quite big over the long run. Next, please. Thank you. So to just wrap it up, what are the policy implications? We have shown you some growth perspectives, including some weaknesses and risks. And Jonah has touched upon some of the findings we had from literature on adaptation and highlighted the lack of adaptation strategy for households and farmers. And then I talked about the lack of job creation. So what are some of the policy implications? In one sentence, that's vibrant competitive firms spurred by greater trade openness and more efficient markets. Those are the key to unlocking job creation, private investment, and private climate adaptation. Thank you. And if you could move to the barcode, that would be great. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Francisca, Patrick, Jonah, and Zoe, for giving us a presentation summarizing the main findings of the latest edition of the South Asia Development Update. Thank you. So we received some questions from the audience in advance. If you did not have opportunities to send your question in advance, please do so by even putting your question on the Q&A or chat section of the YouTube screen, or you can send the email to me directly. But let me start with the first question. Let me read it. South Asia is one of the biggest homes of the poor population in the world. From the analysis of this new report, what can we tell about the trend of the poverty reduction in the region for the foreseeable future or toward 2030? So perhaps I'd like to invite Francisca to come in to make a comment on it. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. So the growth numbers that Patrick presented suggest a mixed picture. So the region as a whole has a quarter of the world's extreme poor. And many of them, given that India accounts for 70% of the region's population, India hosts many of them. And India is growing at a robust pace, faster than other emerging markets and developing economies. But, so India is converging. India's per capita income is converging towards advanced economies. But it is converging at a pace that is not fast enough to get India to its own policy goal, which is to achieve high income status by 2047, 100 years after independence. So yes, that does help poverty reduction. It's just slower than the authorities would like. In the rest of the region, the per capita incomes have actually stopped converging towards advanced economies per capita incomes. And that is mostly because of these very sluggish recoveries from crisis. Often when you have a crisis, you have this strong rebound afterwards when things have been sorted. Not in the countries that were financially stressed, as Patrick called them in his presentation. So there you have a very gradual, underwhelming recovery that prevents per capita incomes from converging with high income countries. And that then, of course, also means that poverty reduction stalls or slows down dramatically. Over back to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So let me read the second question. By the way, those questions came in advance to the seminar. So you may perhaps have already touched upon some of those points raised by the viewers in the question, but let me read the question anyway. So second question, would you please touch upon the biggest challenges which smaller countries in the region, Bhutan and the Maldives, are facing with, and possible actions which should be taken as remedies? in particular, there are any roles which technologies can play, or it would rather be related to human capital or human resources with appropriate skills. So I'd like to invite Patrick, if I may, to come in to make a responses. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah. Small states like Maldives, like Bhutan, have a lot of challenges. It's hard for them to build up economies of scale. They're too small. They have to rely. They're very open to trade and to external shocks. That includes financial shocks because they can't borrow. Their domestic savings pools are very small. They often have a large degree of emigration, a big brain drain, as some people call it, that also makes it challenging for policymakers. That being said, a lot of the policy responses are the same: good, stable governance, investment in human capital, investment in infrastructure, investment in climate change resilience. Another challenge that these countries have is that they often have a lot of vulnerability to climate change, especially small islands that at risk from rising sea levels. So the climate change resilient investment needs are very large. One thing that can help with some of these problems is progress at digitalization and sort of growing the digital economy, making it possible for people to work in the country embedded into the global economy in a way that's difficult to do otherwise. So having a strong digital basis to the economy, good connectivity, good infrastructure can help overcome some of the problems that these countries have. So there's definitely a role for technology.
Well, if I may come in also, this is exactly right. Some of the newer technologies that Patrick mentioned promise big growth spurts. Another one is, for example, green energy. So Bhutan has a lot of hydropower. It could become one of the two batteries of South Asia, the renewable batteries of South Asia, if it can be traded, the hydropower. So there is big promise in green energy, in the whole green energy transition. Maldives has a lot of solar power, potential. And it has these very spread out islands where it's difficult to provide energy in a traditional way. So there is big promise, and the World Bank is engaged in these projects as well, in solar, basically solar, a switch to solar power. Back to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much for your responses. The third question, how does the current trend of the migration in the region make impact on the issues related to job creation, which is required for the further growth? So I'd like to invite Zoe to come in to make a comment. Thank you.
Thank you, Koichi. I think that's a great question, especially given that the South Asia region has seen tremendous growth in out-migration, for good and for bad. We had a report 2 years ago analyzing the migration issue, and to give a more concrete statistics, between 2010 and 2023, the net out-migration represents a loss of about 2% of the region's working age population. So that's quite a substantial issue. So, but given the question, I think we actually think of it in another way, that the growth in out-migration actually represents or is a symptom of the lack of job creation in the region. So think of young people who are trying to find jobs, but there isn't job to be found, or it isn't good enough jobs. And that could spur them to migrate despite the risks and the upfront cost. So that said, we do think that out-migration, if it happens among more skilled population and if they're not coming back, that could potentially represent a brain drain, which could be a pull on the region's productivity growth, and which could in turn impact output growth. So what's the solution? It drains down to job creation and the policy implications we talked about. More market flexibility, greater trade openness. Those policies would help farm growth, help farm hiring, create more job opportunities so that young people, once they study overseas, they'll come back and find jobs. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Zoe, for your responses. The fourth question, vulnerability, particularly Afghanistan situation in the case, is worrisome because it would become additional burden to major impact caused the climate change and natural disasters, caused by the climate change and natural disasters. So what are the priority actions for the leaders of the vulnerable countries should take, and can external partners support in this regard? So I would like to invite Jonah to come in to make a comment on this. Thank you.
Thank you. And that's an important point, right? We know that vulnerability very much is kind of a multidimensional thing, right? We know that climate risk is especially salient or important in these kinds of fragile states, right? Those types of kind of unexpected climate shocks can, in many cases, at least what the research shows, push countries back into fragility or conflict, and so that's obviously a worry in places like Afghanistan. In terms of what countries can do to kind of mitigate some of these vulnerabilities, I think I'd go back to our first kind of key message from our adaptation review, which is that good development is good adaptation, good climate adaptation, right? These countries, particularly those that are starting from such a low base like Afghanistan, need to provide basic public goods and kind of build them from the ground up to increase the resilience of society to the inevitable climate shocks that are kind of only increasing in frequency and severity. And to add to that, social protection is really important for kind of disaster risk management and to increase resilience, particularly of households and farmers in the face of natural disasters. And so, if you have that good development, you can very much kind of mitigate some of those risks. The second key message, I think, was which I think relates to some of the other countries in the region, is that where fiscal positions are somewhat constrained, we need to do more to encourage private sector adaptation, particularly around technology adoption, and those efforts need to be targeted again at households and farms the most, to address the barriers that they have towards adopting more effective adaptation strategies. And then I think the third key message here is it really comes back to what Zoe talked about with jobs, right? We need to improve the non-agricultural sector job creation, and that goes for every country in the region, regardless of the level of fragility that they have, right? Because those labor markets are such an important release valve for climate shocks, and if they're not functioning effectively, that adaptation is not available to households and farmers. And as we mentioned, lots of reforms are necessary. The exact mix will depend on the country, but of course, she mentioned trade openness, she mentioned flexibility in land and labor markets. Those are essential to improving non-agricultural job creation, which will increase resilience and improve adaptation prospects for households. And lastly, I'd like to address the question about kind of what can external partners do. I think it's clear that external partners can support really across all of those dimensions, right? The World Bank can and does provide financing for all of those essential public goods, those social protection systems, those disaster risk management systems. Those need to be functioning really well so that when crisis does happen, we have the right kind of building blocks in place. And then, of course, we provide this kind of technical support and knowledge support on these structural reforms, which will hopefully have the impact of kind of creating more dynamic labor markets.
Thank you very much. So you responded to all the questions that we received in advance. So at this time, I would like to ask Franziska to come in to share any final remarks on behalf of the team. Then we wrap up. Franziska, please.
All right. Thank you. Yeah, it's the one thing that we found in this report that we had not quite realized before is this notion of these double dividends. That climate adaptation is really old-fashioned development. And without the old-fashioned development, the most vulnerable groups in the economy really can't adapt to climate change. That is the thing that really came out in this report. The other aspect that we had not appreciated, that our research in this particular piece gives additional firepower to, is this notion of more jobs. There has long been a tradition in the development community of calling for better jobs, and that is very appropriate. I mean, better jobs are what drives growth, output growth, poverty reduction, fiscal improvements, etc. But what our work here shows, that actually it also needs more jobs. More jobs, just a vibrant non-agricultural job market may not be the most important thing for output growth, but it is critical for climate adaptation, because it is one strategy that households can use when there is no other recourse, when there's no government, no functioning government. Households are back to jobs. So more jobs outside agriculture are actually absolutely critical. So in this sense, this supports a bit the notion that a lot of politicians have, and many economists don't have, that it is more jobs that really matter in addition to the better jobs. So all around, what we learned in this whole report is the nexus between these old-fashioned development priorities of more and better jobs and the new priority, which is climate adaptation. The two really cannot be separated. It is all about double dividends. Thank you, Koichi.
Thank you very much. I was about to wrap up a seminar, but Professor Shimamoto in Kyoto sent the two interesting questions. So let me read those questions and ask you, Francisca, once again to sort of orchestrate the responses from the team. Then we wrap up. So additional few minutes. Thank you for the wonderful presentation on the policy implication. If you streamline the policy implication in sequential order, what to start with? So this is the first question from the Professor Shimamoto. Second question, your observation on the effectiveness of the regional cooperation, i.e. SAARC, if any. So those are the 2 points raised by Professor Shimamoto. So I would like to return the microphone back to Francisca and then share your views on those points. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Shimamoto. These are good questions. What is the prime policy recommendation? The most urgent policy recommendation, I think, that comes together in all the three pieces is really to stimulate the private sector, stimulate firm growth. Firm growth is the thing that will give you private investment. Firm growth is the thing that gives you non-agricultural jobs. So how do we do that? That's of course, that's always a catch. No? That's the difficulty. So that's why we ran this regression that Zoe showed you. And there is one area which doesn't only correlate strongly with private investment and job creation. It's also the area where South Asia ranks particularly poorly, and that is trade. It is really extraordinary how low the trade to GDP ratio, export to GDP ratios, how little integrated the region is with the rest of the world. So if you ask me what would be a prime priority, it would be simply opening up. Now, you mentioned in your second question about this regional cooperation. And yes, of course, it's well known that this region is the least integrated within the region of all the emerging market and developing economy regions. But the problem is actually much broader. It is just trade. It's just global integration. The region has higher tariffs. The region has higher non-tariff barriers. The region has higher shipping costs. The region is not on any of the major shipping lanes. They tend to be over the Pacific and a bit further around Africa. So the region is really disadvantaged in terms of trade. So it has to make an extra effort on its own, each government on its own, even if it cannot agree with any of its trading partners. There's a lot of things that each government can do on its own to reduce trade costs. Trade facilitation measures, the WTO agreement, border procedures, digitization, what Patrick mentioned. A lot of things can be done at home to stimulate trade, and then with trade, stimulate domestic competition. and expand access to markets that will then also help firms grow. So all these little firms that create hardly any jobs can become medium-sized firms and actually start creating some jobs. Back to you, Koichi. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Franziska, Patrick, Jonah, and Zoe, for your time to join us this morning in Japan time. We had the great seminar featuring the South Asia Development Update, the latest edition titled Jobs for Resilience. Thank you very much, all of you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you. It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So next week we are going to feature the Africa's Pulse, which is the Africa version of the Regional Economic Update. This is going to be at 8 a.m. on the Friday, April 26th in Japan Standard Time. And then actually we continue our journey through different regions. Latin America and the Caribbean regional update is going to be the May 1st. The Europe and Central Asia economic update is going to be May the 2nd. We are now in coordination with the MENA team in terms of the date to be fixed. And also, after Japanese Golden Weeks, we are going to have two interesting seminars coming up. One is the Digital Progress and Trends Report 2023. This is going to be May 7th. And also, Women Business and the Law, latest edition, is going to be featured on May 10th. So please stay tuned. Check the latest information on our website. Then see you next time. Actually, see you next week for the Africa's Pulse. Thank you very much.